Good evening, everyone. How are you guys doing today? Welcome to our Fireside chat series, Counseling Careers and Grad School for Korean Americans. My name is Charles, and I'm one of the volunteers with Mustard Seed Generation, and I'll be your MC for this evening. First of all, we want to welcome you. We're so glad you're here with us, and I really hope this time will be beneficial and encouraging for you. As you're settling in, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, where you're joining from, or any other fun facts. It's always exciting to see how wide and global our MSG community really is. By the way, I'm joining from Boston. My base home is Texas, so anybody from there, shout out. Throughout this event, we really want to hear from you. So if you have any thoughts or questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can during Q&A. And if you want to ask something anonymously, you can send it to G1, our tech support for tonight. Now, it's my honor to introduce our amazing speaker for tonight, Dr. Josephine Kim. She's the faculty director of the school counseling licensure pathway at Harvard University, a licensed mental health counselor, a national certified counselor, and also the founder of Mustard Seed Generation. Dr. Joe, we're so grateful to have you with us, and everyone, please give her a virtual warm welcome.
Aw, thank you, Charles. It's so great to see you. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Oh, it's great to see everyone from, wow, Illinois, Canada, New York, California, Charles and I, Boston, Cambridge.
Hey, well, we've received a lot of questions in advance, and so first few questions are about transitioning into mental health field, exploring different career pathways. So here's the first questions. Hi, Dr. Joe. I've been accepted into mental health counseling master's program starting fall 2025. Upon graduation, I'm considering whether to pursue LMHC licensure or go onto a PhD program to become a licensed psychologist, also known as LP. Could you speak to the differences between LMHC and LP in terms of job opportunities,
Hmm.
responsibilities, and long-term job security? Similarly, how would you compare LMHC with LCSW, licensed clinical social worker pathways? Are there key differences in scope, training, or job options that we should consider when choosing between these?
Yeah, so what I hear is it sounds like somebody's interested in maybe the counseling, which leads to Massachusetts at least, a licensed mental health counselor, which is what I also hold. In other states, that's going to look like a licensed professional counselor. There are lots of different labels of that license. It's interesting in the US that every state has its own jurisdiction over the licenses that are given, right? So the LMHC is very specific to Massachusetts and perhaps the New England area. But it sounds like
Mhm.
somebody's interested in, what's the difference maybe between counseling, psychology, and social work? And so maybe we can start there. I would
Mm.
say psychology is much more about mental illnesses, diagnoses, pathologies. And so if you're really interested in, let's say, schizophrenia, you're interested in bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, while counselors would also address the overlaps between all three, by the way, are pretty great. Um, but a psychologist actually would get into kind of the heavy duty mental illnesses and the pathologies and the diagnosis, right? And so it also involves assessments, where you would use assessments to actually then land on a diagnosis, right? Whereas a counselor, I would say it's more about everyday life issues. So relationship issues, cultural identity, maybe you're having decision-making issues, right? Maybe it's about your career, maybe it's about friendships. I mean, any of those things that are more related to everyday life situations and less about, I would say, a diagnosis. Even though counselors do, right, treat diagnoses, I would say it's less about that than it is about everyday life issues. A social worker, very similar. But a social worker is, if you can imagine kind of broadening your scope a little bit and thinking about more systems level, right? So you're thinking about the environment, you care whether a client is going to be homeless or not, whether they are food insecure or not. So you're really working with different social networks and engaging those resources for your client. So a lot of social workers actually will do therapy, but not so much in terms of they're much more about broadening the scope and making sure the environments are safe, that this person actually has everything that they need, whether it's maybe sometimes medical insurance, right, housing, again, food security, all of those things. And so, again, the overlaps are there, but they're subtly different. And so, if I were to distinguish, let's say, a licensed psychologist versus an LMHC, again, a licensed psychologist is going to do therapy, whereas a counselor does counseling. So you might say, well, what's the difference between that? In our fields, we look at counseling again as everyday life issues. And the main difference is that counseling is very short term. So it's very rare that a counselor is going to actually see someone for years and years and years. Whereas a psychologist, it's not so uncommon to have clients who are with the same psychologist for a dozen years, right? 10, 12 years, 20 years sometimes. And it's much more long term. So if you can imagine what the main differences might be in a short-term counseling situation versus a long-term therapy situation, right? And again, therapy is going to focus much more on the pathology. I hope that helps a little bit. Again, the lines are very blurred, but still there are subtle differences.
I mean, as someone who's also starting out the new journey into field of psychology, I think this is really helpful resources. I wish I could have had this before I applied, but it's all
Yeah.
so there are more questions related to these area. Is it really realistically feasible to pursue LMHC while also completing a doctorate program at the same time? I'd love to hear your thoughts on balancing both academically and practically.
Sure. I mean, for people who are considering a doctorate, this is what I would say. If your main focus is practice, so you want to maybe open up private practice, you want to maybe be a part of an agency or a center doing the actual like practicing, right? Whether it's therapy or counseling. In order to do that, what you actually need is a license, not a doctorate, right? And so if that's your end goal, then I would say go for your license. And every single state in the United States, it's going to require, right, in order to be licensed, it's going to require 2 years of a master's program in counseling or psychology, right? And so, knowing that, you have to go to a through a master's program for 2 years, and then you have to accrue all of the hours that the state says it requires for you to be licensed. And so, we're talking about face-to-face hours where you actually do counseling or therapy. We're also talking about supervision hours where somebody who already holds the license that you're seeking is now supervising you, right? At least once a week. And so, you have to accrue a certain amount of hours. Don't be shocked. But in Massachusetts, after your 2 years of a master's, you actually need over 3,000 hours of face-to-face work in order to even be license eligible, right? Um, Believe it or not, that's actually very minimal compared to
Mm,
other states. Other states actually require a lot more than that. I actually came from Virginia. And so when I got my doctorate, and the reason I got my doctorate was my doctoral program actually had a counseling center embedded into the program. And so all of my professors were actually licensed. We were actually practicing within the center, right, that was housed under our doctoral program. And so I was able to accrue all those hours during my doctorate. And so going back to your question, Charles, there are ways that you can actually set yourself up that, let's say you go through a master's and you have to accrue, let's say, 3,000 hours to be licensed as an LMHC or a licensed mental health counselor. Then you might say, well, how about, eventually I want to go get my doctorate. So how about I get myself into a clinical, right? Like
mm, mm,
counseling doctoral program and kind of double dip because while you're there, you're having to accrue those hours. It's postmasters, and so it's all going to count towards your licensure. And if your faculty are licensed in the license that you're pursuing, then any conversation you have about clients, any class time you have with them, all of it can count towards supervision hours, right? Otherwise, you kind of have to pay for it out of pocket. And so
mm.
these are all kind of perks of getting into a doctoral program. And your hope is that by the time you finish your doctoral program, you are license eligible, meaning you've accrued all the hours you need, you've taken all the courses that you need. It's also a great way to make sure you're meeting all the requirements. So, for example, certain master's programs, like ours, for example, is a school counseling master's program. So we actually don't have a course on specifically addictions. We
Mm,
don't have a course specifically on diagnoses, right? Because school counselors actually don't do diagnosing. But depending on which licensure you're seeking, you're going to require those classes. And so if you know that, instead of again going out of pocket and paying extra for those classes as a kind of an offside experience, if you happen to be in a doctoral program, then you can imagine how you can take those classes, right, that you may have missed during your master's. Now you can get it during your doctoral program while you're accruing your hours. Ooh, that was lengthy, but
gotcha.
I hope that made sense. Yeah.
It definitely did. It definitely did. We have some live questions as well, and Julie
Sure.
asked, like, is it possible to become a therapist in the States with a foreign master's degree? And what are your thoughts on
Mm.
this?
Yeah, so you're going to have to make a strong case for getting those courses, right, that you took for your master's in, let's say, Korea or wherever you're marketing from. You're going to have to make a strong case to the licensing board that they were
Mm,
equivalent, right, to what's being required in the US. What's interesting about this is that each institution, right, every college, every university only accepts a certain number of outside credits, right, taken from other institutions. And so it also could mean that there were differences in what was required, let's say, in Korea and here. And so you may actually end up needing to take a few more courses, right? And what's great about that, or a great way to actually meet those courses is now they have Certificate of Advanced Study, which is technically a second year or additional coursework that you can do on top of your master's. And so it is possible, in my opinion, that if you're coming in with a master's, right, and very close to being licensed, then here you would just make up the courses that you might be lacking just because, standards are going to be different, and then making sure you've got all the face-to-face hours and supervision hours, right?
gotcha. I just received another questions regarding I think like it really depends on the status. So this person asked, like, as an international student, how should I navigate the visa process, especially after using OPT for licensure training? I'm concerned about what options are available once OPT ends. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, limited knowledge here when it comes to the only way I know as much as I do is because I'm supporting international students in our
Mm,
programs. And so
mm,
depending on which master's program you graduate from, your OPT, if it falls under, let's say, a STEM category, so
mm,
our school actually worked it out so that now we've kind of made a strong case that counseling too can be under STEM. And because of that, their OPT now
mm,
lasts for 3 years and not just one additional year. Right. So it gives our students a little bit more time and leeway. Of course, let's just name it that we don't know how things will change, but
mm,
right, with the current realities, but that is the change that we made. And so what we've done for our students is with the 3 years of OPT, it's usually enough for you to accrue as many hours as you can, so that
mm,
you can be licensed, right, fully before you actually have to leave. Or if you can make a strong case that what you have to offer above and beyond what others in this nation can bring to the field, if you can establish that, right, and make a strong case for yourself, then you might actually also be able to find a job. And here's a hint, right, especially for those of us who are bicultural and bilingual. One of the biggest, I would say, challenges and beauties of the field is that we've got many immigrants and newly arrived folks and refugee communities coming in. And
mm,
oftentimes they need people who can scaffold, right, and kind of, bridge the cultural gap, the language gap, all of these things. And so if you can make, in my opinion, right, your biggest bet will be to make a strong case for why your biculturalism, bilingualism, and your ability to be able to straddle both cultures or multiple cultures is actually
mm.
useful for a certain agency or a center, then they can make a strong case that, yes, we actually need this person for this particular role. And that's a way that you can make a strong case for yourself. Yeah.
Gotcha. Because we just talked about like different cultures and identity. There were also questions related to Asian American identity, and the questions was, do you have any recommendation for PhD programs in counseling or psychology that centers the Asian or Asian American experience? It's been challenging to find the programs that reflects our unique cultural context.
Right. So both validating what you're saying as very true. You know, there's a reason Asian Americans are called the invisible, right, population community.
Hmm.
Because oftentimes we've been kind of ignored and our history has been erased. And again, we've been rendered invisible, I think, for a long time. And so what's exciting is that, yes, there are more and more programs now, academic programs that really, I wouldn't say they actually would kind of at the broad level say this is a program only for Asian Americans. But I'm thinking of William James College, for example, in the Boston area. It's a clinical psychology program, but they actually have, for example, Asian mental health concentration, Latine, American concentration, African American, Black concentration. And so we're sharing that link with you just as an example of what exists. And so when you're in programs like that, yes, you'll be taking general psychology and counseling classes and learning all of the things you need to as a psychologist, but you're also concentrating, right, in saying this piece is very important to me. And now you get to learn culture specific things, cultural relevance in the things that you're doing. I think what it also does is it gives you a space to actually think about the application of what you're learning. Okay, so I took a class in psychosocial assessments, right? So now how do I actually approach this when it comes to Korean Americans, right?
Mm.
When Korean parents are so, let's say, hesitant to have their children assessed, right, with any type of outcomes because they feel like it's going to be included in their college essay, et cetera, college portfolios. How do we approach it in a culturally sensitive manner and get the buy-in of these parents? I think it creates that level of space and opportunity to think about the application. And so, yeah, how exciting. More and more, I think we're seeing it. I also want to say you may be, I don't know, in Arizona and they really don't have a strong Asian American presence. I'm just guessing here. Utah,
Hmm.
I don't know. Um, and you really want to do this work. I would say as a doctoral program or, a student or even a master's student, when you're doing your thesis, my one recommendation is any course you take, you're going to have final projects and you're going to, have to produce work, right? And
Mm.
oftentimes in the counseling and psychology world, your final assignments are something that can be applied to a community that you're passionate about. And so for me, I'll just use myself as an example. Every single course I took, child and adolescence, right? Marriage and family, psychosocial assessment, whatever
Mm.
it was, I made sure that it was very focused on the Asian American community. And each class I took and each assignment that I approached, I would take it a little bit deeper. And so
Mm.
by the time I finished my doctorate, honestly, I kind of emerged as, what they would call like an expert, because for a long time during my academics, that's what I would do. In each course, I would just take a slightly different angle, but make sure I don't lose kind of my passion area, right? Which happened to be Asian Americans and specifically Korean Americans. And so if you can still find ways to do that, I would say the only thing you need to do is make sure that you have a dissertation chair or an advisor who will champion for you to do this. Even when I was getting my doctorate and I wanted to look at something very Korean American specific, I had plenty of faculty say to me, like, that's too narrow. Like, why don't you broaden it to Asian Americans? Why don't you broaden it to immigrants or minorities, right? And at the end of the day, after doing a lot of introspection and contemplation, I thought actually it doesn't float my boat. It doesn't excite me as much to kind of look at the general immigrant population. Like it really excited me to think about Korean Americans, right? And so I didn't
Mm.
want to throw that out. And what I'm so grateful for is I actually ended up switching my advisor and getting a new dissertation chair. And that was really unheard of in any doctoral program. But
Yeah.
that was important for me because I needed somebody who would champion, right, what I was proposing to do. And certainly my chair was able to do that for me. And so I think there are ways to do it, even if your program itself doesn't have these spaces embedded into the program.
Wow. I think like always hearing personal stories is empowering us and knowing that we're not alone. And we know where to go to. And I think this guest is also asking about your personal stories. Like he or she shared, as someone in my 40s, transitioning into my third career in social work and mental health counseling, I've often felt that our strength as Asian Americans aren't fully acknowledged, and neither are our struggles. The model minority myth still seems
Right.
deeply ingrained, even in the mental health field. Could you speak to what you've personally or professionally observed around this, especially outside academic spaces and more within clinical or community settings? What changes have you seen, and where do you feel we still need to grow?
Yeah, and you know what? I think it's because you're in your 40s. You may feel a little bit stronger about this than people who are like in their 20s, right?
Mm,
And even in their late teens right now. I do think it is a big shift that we've made. Um, but that's the thing, right? Like any program you have or any field of study is always going to be a microcosm of the broader society, right? And so the model minority myth that exists out in broader society, you're actually going to see that in your academic program. You're going to see that outside, right? In practice, in the centers that you'll belong to, or internet or practicomat, do your practicomat. And so I think that too is definitely a reality. So I don't want to invalidate that. And also, I think a huge encouragement for us is that things have shifted quite a bit with the globalization. I think, especially with like K beauty, K food, K drama, all of
mm,
these things. Excuse me, that I think has brought it to the fore a little bit more. And so I do think the younger generations that are coming up have a different experience than perhaps, you and I did back in the day. Not to negate that it is definitely a real reality. Another important and exciting difference is that we have more and more representation. Believe it or not, when I was getting my doctorate, this was in 2002 when I first started. And as a big part of my graduate research, like assistantship, I actually looked at every single state in the United States to see if there was a Korean American clinician, right?
mm,
If even one could be found in every single state. And guess what? In 2002, with the limited internet access at that time, I was able to find some Korean American clinician in every single state, even Idaho and Arizona and all these other places, right? And so how exciting was that? And so if I was able to do that in 2002, now in 2025, especially with the younger generation who's much more savvy when it comes to mental health literacy and understanding the importance of it, I do think the landscape has changed quite a bit. Um, and again, it's like two truths holding, they seem to be contradicting each other, but they're both true. Yes, things
mm,
have shifted quite a bit, the landscape and all of this, representation is much better, and we have a long way to go, right? Yeah.
mm. Yeah, we also have a questions from an Korean student. As an international Korean student, I'm wondering if I'll be able to practice in Korea after getting licensed.
Oh, what's really interesting and exciting is that in Korea, there's such a growing number of expats. So, expats are people who left at one point and are coming back, right? So, a lot of immigrants who left Korea are now coming back to resettle in Korea.
Mm,
And so, because of that, there's been a bigger demand for licensed clinicians who actually are bilingual and bicultural, right, for the expat community. So when I say expat, I'm talking about all the military folks, I'm talking about all the international schools. And if you were to Google now, there are just tens and tens and tens now in Korea, right? And so anytime in these environments, there's a mental health issue or they need somebody to do a psycho assessment, right, or an eval, then you actually have so many centers now that are up and coming that provide therapy and counseling in English, right? And biculturally too, and bilingually, which is amazing. And so, all of that to say, yes, I do believe that you'll be able to do this. In fact, I've had several students who actually went back with their license and practiced in Korea under one of these international agencies. Yeah.
that's really good to know. Uh, Another person asked, are there any like specialized classes or training centered around caring for Korean Americans?
Mm. I think it'll be pretty rare that you might find like a Korean American mental health course that you could take, but who knows? I would say, probably on the West Coast, you might be able to find it. I think it's going to be more Asian American, honestly,
Mm,
and then you might, within a course like that, have subsets, of different ethnic groups that they might get into. Usually, probably like East Asians, South Asians, Southeast Asians, right? And even Southwest Asians. And so, yes and no, right? But
mhm.
again, this is why representation is so important, and we need everybody in this space to go and pursue, right, the field, so that you can actually come back and contribute, right? And it's part of exactly why what made me kind of, be drawn to the field and do what I do. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we're still getting a lot of questions regarding Korean Americans. And another question
Oh.
is, could you speak to the difference in the way Korean Americans view mental health versus Koreans? Do younger generations from the US or Korea see mental health in more similar ways?
Yeah, the current trends that I've seen are, it may be quite shocking, but I think for those of us who are Korean American immigrants, right? So remember the big wave of Korean Americans immigrated right after the Korean War, which would be in the 50s, right? And
Mm,
then after that, the second wave was around late 70s and early 80s, and I belonged to part of that second wave of huge immigration from Korea. And so, what's interesting, and I mentioned that because what we know as immigrants is, especially the parent generation, the immigrant generation, they really hold fast to what they remember back then, right? So, it's not uncommon to see immigrants who are in their 70s and 80s now, who still kind of hold on to the way Korea was in the 60s and 70s and 80s. In fact, they're probably much more Korean than Koreans are in Korea themselves, right? Because there's a way that we call this enculturation when you're holding on to your heritage because you feel like you're going to lose it. And that's a
mm,
psychological thing that happens with immigrants, right? If you don't hold on to it, then you're going to lose it. And you watch your children become very Americanized and you overcompensate for that by holding on even tighter, right? So I mentioned that to say, I would say the immigrants here, Korean Americans, and the way we view mental health is much less progressive than Koreans view it.
mm.
And Korea is really interesting because anytime there's a social issue or a political issue, do you know what Korea does? Any
What do they
guesses?
do?
They put it in a K-drama. Come on. Right? If you have domestic violence issues and it's like on the rise, you'll see it in K-drama. If you see a child who's struggling with their mental health, you'll see it in K-drama. And what do? They get the child in counseling in K-drama,
Mm,
right?
mm,
And by doing this, they actually socially influence, right? The nation because so many people consume the dramas. And it's actually quite powerful if you think about it. And because
mm,
of that, it's become much more normalized. In fact,
mm,
watch any drama where a child experiences trauma or, parental separation or some sort of violence. You'll actually see embedded into that drama that child actually going to art therapy or going to
mm,
counseling or doing family therapy, right? And I think
mm,
because of these measures, Korea is much more progressive now, I would say, than we are here. We're kind of stuck. I always say it's my 30th year being in the field, believe it or not,
oh.
right? I know I started when I was two, but but I mentioned that to say, I know Chiwon's laughing at me. I mentioned that to say, how is it that we're still addressing the same issues, right? That I know I was talking about and addressing 30 years ago. It's just so challenging to shift.
Mm, mm,
Whereas in Korea, I would say, again, they're very quick to shift
mm.
and change. Yeah.
That's really great to see. And
Mm.
you were a genius. You started this when you were two.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Child prodigy.
And some people were asking like what skills are most demand in this field, and other questions were, what are the if I haven't majored in psychology in undergrad, what are something I can do to prepare for masters? And I think it's all
Oh,
related
yeah,
to
yeah.
yeah, yeah, to
Yeah, I was
the
gonna
like
say.
Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
Yep, I lack mental capacity, so just one question at a time would be good.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
think the first one was skills. What skills do I need?
Hmm.
We need clinicians who can look at the entire context and see
Mm.
somebody and be able to make sense of their historical context, right? And see them in a holistic way, and also be mindful of the different systems that this person has to navigate. So I
Mm.
always say, like, somebody's mental health is really, it sits right at the intersection of all of the stuff within my own community and my individual factors. But as a minority member in the United States, for example, there's so many external systemic things that are pushing on me that often
Mm.
keep me very vulnerable. And so we need more and more clinicians who can actually be aware, right, of all of those things. Like what this person is bringing as an individual. Let's say, I immigrated in the 80s, then historically, I can place you, right, in what was happening historically, under what conditions you probably immigrated, right,
Mm.
for what, dream and goal your parents brought you here. Like all of that can be placed because, right? This is why we have to study history, right? Because we know
Mm.
we are kind of a product of what happened in the past, right? And so we need people who can do that and not just look at something very simplistically. For example, if somebody tells me that they're depressed, guess what? The last thing I do is ask about their depression, right?
Mm.
One of the key things I do is ask them, okay, how is your sleep quality? Are you getting physical exercise? How many friends would you say you're able to connect with, right? So what am I
Mm.
doing by doing that? I'm looking to see what types of context this person is in, because all of that actually matters when it comes to this person's manifestation of depression. Depression, remember, anytime we have a mental illness, it's a manifestation of something, not necessarily the issue in itself. Does that make sense? So I
Mm.
think we need more and more people who are skilled, and also, you have to just grow your awareness exponentially in all sorts of things, right? If I'm supporting an African American student, then I need to know what historical context they're bringing, right? I need to know, yeah, exactly what kind of a school environment this child is in, what kind of
Mm.
cultural, right, boundaries and norms and values this child is navigating and negotiating constantly, because all of that is actually then kind of again manifesting, right, either well or positively or negatively in this child's life. And so I think
Mm.
that's a skill in itself, and you can't quite fine tune that skill until you actually get to know all sorts of people and have multiple types of experiences. I think one of the best things I did in starting out in this field is I
Mm.
didn't limit myself to a context. So I was in residential care facilities, I was in day treatment centers, I was in school-based, home-based, hospitals, psychiatric wards. I was also in
Mm.
jails, right? Working with people who were incarcerated. And I'm so really grateful that I had these opportunities to do that, because I
Mm.
think the more you do that, the more exposure you have, and the more you can see what's in the DSM, right? Kind of come alive to see what it looks like. There's only so much you can gain from reading and hearing about and wrestling with case studies, right? We all need that, and the role plays are really wonderful, and that's all of this will be a big part of your training. But you also do have to just kind of get out there, even though it's a little bit scary in the beginning, and really kind of experience it, because only then can you learn certain nuances that textbooks
Mm.
and articles, cannot actually give you.
Mm.
And what was the
Mm.
second question, Charles?
So the second question was like, what are like if you're not major in psychology in
Mm.
undergrad, like what are some things that the person needs to do to prepare? Yeah.
Yeah, the beauty of an American US system, educational system, is that you literally can go as a, business major and come
Mm.
to become a counselor, right? And so I would say, unlike the like medical field, there aren't too many prerequisites. I think most programs are set up in such a way that it kind of assumes you're not bringing too
Mm.
much to the table, especially at the master's level. And so, what it's going to do is it'll carefully scaffold your courses and experiences so that you're slowly building up and getting those building blocks. And so, I don't think it hurts to take, a course or two in psychology before you dive into a master's program. Um, but I would say also watching a lot of documentaries and learning in other ways, right? Learning about different cultures and again the history and the context of people's lived experiences. I think all of that is beneficial. And I would say any type of people-facing work that you engage
Mm.
in is always going to be helpful. Whether that's like direct work, like a teacher or a camp counselor, even indirect work where you're doing case management and you're having to consult with families or work with coworkers, anything that is again people facing, that's really valuable in this field.
Well, it's interesting because you just mentioned about people facing, and we're also living in a world where lots of AI technology is coming in. And this person asked, with the increasing presence of AI in mental health spaces, do you think the job prospects for mental health counselors and therapists will remain strong? And there's also talk that it may be harder to find a job after completing PhD in counseling compared to entering the field with just masters. And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so let's get to the AI thing
Yeah.
first, and then I'll
Mhm.
probably need you to
Yeah.
remind me about the second question
No
again.
worries, no worries.
Yeah, the AI thing, I would say, contrary to what most people think, they might think that AI might replace, right, like human connection when it comes to
Mhm.
counseling or social work or psychologists or even psychiatrists. But I would argue that I think it enriches our work. For example, a big part of what counselors do, for example, is note taking, right? We have
Mm,
to create a summary after we've met with the client. I think that's where AI can help us. Like it'll come in and kind of do the work for us. Of course, like confidentiality is another huge issue that the AI field is trying to tackle when it comes to our field. But my gosh, if I can leave that to an AI and also then be able to look over the work of the AI to make sure it's accurate and to my liking, that
mm,
would save me so much time, which might actually mean I could see somebody else, right? Because I have the energy and the time to be able to do that. And so I would say AI, I think, is enriching the way we do certain things.
mm.
I think it's also making, let's say, counseling more approachable in very
Yes.
surface level things. But there is just no way that an AI would be able to pick up on the nuances that a trained
Mm,
professional would be able to, right? So, I could ask AI, like, what would you say to somebody who's saying, I want to die today, right? It'll
mm,
give you a long list. And I would say because AI is so smart. Why? Because humans created it, right? It's going to give you accurate things, but is it also going to give you the rapport that you need to actually work with this person, right?
mm,
I mean,
mm,
in our field, when you're struggling at any
mm,
point, we always default to that relationship. By the way, people think counseling is just like talking to people. Counseling is actually this relationship you create, a therapeutic relationship and a therapeutic rapport we create with the person seated in front of us, right?
mm,
So if we
mm.
look at that working definition of what counseling is, I'm not quite sure an AI can replace me when it comes to that. Right. Like an AI might not be able to, crack a Konglish joke like I can, right? And use bilingualism to like kind of, work with the parents and the child in the way that I might be able to, and also pick up, as I said, those nuances, right? That hopefully a live person can pick up.
Yeah, yeah. We also have a questions related to a mental health professionals in a church setting. So, have you ever reflected on the differences between working as a mental health professionals and offering support within a church setting? In a clinical setting, ethical guidelines restricts relationships outside of counseling, but within a church, you may offer support while also maintaining an ongoing relationship. How do you navigate or discern when it's more appropriate to pursue a path in a clinical counseling versus offering a care with church or ministry boundaries?
Fine. This is a tricky one, right? Because if we're talking
Mm-hmm.
specifically about Korean American churches, like immigrant churches, The idea of confidentiality is it sometimes just doesn't exist, right? Like, oh, I'm just telling you so you can pray for them, right?
Mm,
And then there's like a breach of confidentiality. And so, personally, for me, I of course support people in the church, right? If they come to me with an issue, they find out what I do for a living, so then they come and they talk to me about certain things. I actually wouldn't call that counseling per se, and I would be very upfront with them. Like, I just want
mm,
you to know this is not counseling, right? This is not what I would do if you were to come see me as a client. And technically, I probably wouldn't accept them as a client either, right? Because I'm very worried and conscious of a potential dual relationship. And we know
mm,
dual relationships actually end up hurting the client a lot more than the clinician themselves, right? And so because of that, I probably wouldn't accept that person as a client. But in the church, I like to call it consultation. Like, I wouldn't provide you counseling, but if a one-time like consultation about your child would be helpful, then sure, that's something I'd be very open to, right? But again, I would
mm,
say the nature of that conversation would be very different. As a
mm,
like a consultant or just somebody with some resources that might be helpful than as if, I were their counselor. I think more and more churches now are finding, though, especially in Korean spaces and other spaces too, that they already go to clergy much more so than a professional like psychologist or counselor, right? So why not kind of take the work and the resource to where the people are? And I think that works really well too. It just needs a lot of boundaried, right? Like systems. I would say a great example of this might be the Redeemer Church. They also have a Redeemer counseling center, but you can
mm,
tell that even though they're associated, they're still like very boundaried. And yeah, and honestly, it's because of those liability issues of confidentiality, the dual relationships, right? Those types of
mm.
things. Yeah, and I think Jiwon shared that link here too, if anybody wants to explore that a little bit further. Uh,
Awesome. And I just realized that I skipped the second question the right
mm,
before. And so it's about finding the job opportunities for psychologists versus master level therapist.
mm.
Yeah.
Right. And how I think the other part was how having a doctorate might actually hinder you from finding a job. Was that
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think ultimately it's what you're aiming for. If practice is what you want, then I probably wouldn't encourage somebody to go get their doctorate because you don't need it, right?
Mm,
Ultimately, if you want to practice, you need your license. What does that mean? In the United States, in all states, you need 2 years of a master's program, right? Either in counseling or psychology or whichever, field, like the subset of field that you want to go into. And then you need to accrue those hours, supervision, as well as the face-to-face practice hours. That's all you need for licensure. And that's all you would need for practice, right? Some people
mm,
might say, well, why did you go and get your PhD? I think for me, it was important that it might sound funny, but as much as I enjoy counseling, I actually enjoy teaching about it much more, right? And because of that, that's why I went into academia and got into higher ed, right? Where I am a counselor educator and I teach training, right? Counselors in
mm,
training to become counselors. And for me, that felt more of a fit for me and where I felt more of a calling. And so for me, a doctorate was a must, right? In order to get into higher education and do the teaching. And so it really depends on your end goal, I would say. Job
mm,
security wise, I do think there are more and more. We're seeing, lots of people who are interested in this field. Honestly, I think it's because life gets hard and hard, and you're like, wow, we all needed this and we didn't have it, right? We didn't have those spaces where we could talk and name our feelings and talk about these experiences that we're all kind of, living through. And I think because of that, we see a lot of people coming into the field. But
mm,
yeah, job security wise, I think, again, you have to carve out a niche for yourself, right? So psychology is one thing, but what about psychology really excites you? If I were to do
mm,
counseling, but I didn't look at cultural identity, I didn't look at what it means to fit into a host culture while you're trying to navigate a different home culture, speaking different languages, and thinking about racial identity development, right alongside with adolescent development. If I didn't care about all of those things, then I don't know if this field would be as meaningful to me. You know what I
Mm,
mean? So it's like you need to find that niche, that one area of psychology or counseling that really excites you, and when I say that, that sounds really abstract, but what I mean is oftentimes we've got things that we're naturally drawn to. We're also naturally good at certain things because we, right, all have our talents and skills. But what we
mm,
can't ignore is also our life experiences, right? For me, we immigrated here. I was uprooted and taken back to Korea. I had to, not only adjust well to this host culture, but I had to go back to Korea because by then, when I went back, it looked very foreign to me. I had to
mm,
culturally adapt again. And then I had to come back to the US. I've done this probably over 100 times. And I thought, how come nobody ever sat me down and said, all of these things that you're experiencing, like, what am I? Am I Korean? Am I American? I don't
mm,
belong here. My Korean's not good enough. I don't think I'm not American enough. Right. I always used to wonder how come nobody just sat me down and said, Joe,
mm,
those things are very normal for people who have had your life experience. If only one caring adult could have normalized that experience for me, it really would have made a huge difference. And for me, that's what I draw upon. Like, that's why I got into this field. What I didn't have, I wanted to be able to provide for the younger generation. Right. And so we all have, I want to say, like that angle that really makes us excited, keeps us up at night because your brain is just like always going, like, what more can I do? Right. And you're eager to wake up and go study because you can't wait to learn more to do this thing. And I would say that's your passion area. And so you should always keep that alive, whether it's a doctorate, whether it's, LMHC or your master's. Yeah.
gotcha. Uh, um, I think this could be our last questions. Could you share some of the honest challenges and rewards of working in this field? I'd love to hear both the tough parts and the meaningful or fulfilling aspects from your personal experience.
Yeah, unlike any other position or job out there,
Mm,
we're really in this to work ourselves out of a job. Think about that, right?
mm,
Like, this is that one field where we get into it because we want to work ourselves out of this job. Like, this one particular student who's struggling with this one thing. I want to be out of this job, meaning the student can do this without leaning
mm,
on me, right? And so I think that's probably the most fulfilling thing. Some people might say when I talked about the consulting, like the one-off session of consulting in a church, or whatever, they might say, well, what kind of impact could that have? You'd be surprised, right? Because so much of this work is it's the belief that we bring to it, right? So if I meet with somebody and I have this belief that you indeed will get better, right? And that,
mm,
yeah, it will happen for you, then it's really amazing. That's why we're live people, right? Just like we co-regulate, I should be able to walk into a space, right? And let's say I've got 5 teenagers who are highly anxious and like this. I should be able to walk in, and because I'm co-regulating with them, right?
mm,
My nervous system begins to kind of work on their nervous system. And before they know it, they actually are mirroring, right? What I'm actually bringing into the space, and they're calm. Isn't that amazing? Like, that is the power of, I think, what a counselor can do and what a caring adult can do, right?
mm,
And so I think that really is a very fulfilling part of the work. It is a hard field. It's hard because it's not as simple as if you break an arm, you go to the ER, get an x-ray, get a cast for however long, 6 weeks or whatever, go through the physical therapy. It's not a path it doesn't have a clear trajectory because it's so individual.
yes.
Because let's say your depression, Charles, could look very different from my depression, right?
Mm-hmm.
And depending on who's seated in front of you and what they're sharing with you, your protocol changes. And that is where it gets really, really hard. right?
Mm,
Because again, it's not like, oh, if they show A, you do this. If they show B, you do this. It's not like that. And this is why so much work and so much education and so much thinking and feeling and just wrestling with these issues have to be done. Otherwise, we can't be good at what we do, right?
mm,
And again, we always default to that relationship. And so you really do have to like people in this field. People are shocked, but I'm a huge introvert, right? I could go months without seeing people. And yet here I am as a counselor. It's like, how did this happen? But you do have to have a fundamental, I think, care for people,
mm,
but that's
mm,
hard, right? Because that means you will burn out. That means sometimes you will care a little bit too
mm,
much. That means you will take home, right? All the secondary trauma and the vicarious kind of, victimization that this person has just shared with you. You will carry some of that on your shoulders. I think we get better at it, right? The longer we practice. But yeah, all of those things are very hard, and I think it's also a field that really shows us the depravity of humanness. Just how depraved human beings can be, right?
mm,
And that is
mm,
the sinful nature, right? And it is a field where you get to see a concentration of it, right?
mm,
I can tell you some child abuse stories that will literally blow your minds, right?
mm,
Things that you will not even see in a movie. It is that far-fetched and that extraordinary and that stunning, right? And if you're a caring person, very challenging to witness and hear about
mm.
and kind of sit through, right? Because so much of the work is sitting in the pain with people. It's so difficult to do that and then be like, "Okay, let's go have some lunch." Right? Yeah, I mean, there were
Yes.
times where I would wake up in the middle of the night just weeping,
Mm,
and it wasn't planned because I was just sleeping, and then I would just wake up and just start to weep, but that's how I was carrying the load
mm.
that was being shared with me, and again, I do think those things get better, but, yeah, those are real challenges for sure.
Oh,
So, definitely fulfilling and also very challenging. Yeah.
well, thank you so much for your invaluable insights and like even your reflections and your vulnerable parts. I think personally I've learned a lot what kind of mindsets, skills, and like so on, like what I need to do to be prepared as a psychologist or mental counselors. We have
Mhm.
lots of questions, but unfortunately, it's our time. But we will keep your questions and give feedback to you in some other way. But thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Joe. We really appreciate it. But before we close out tonight, I just wanted to quickly share a few resources that might be helpful for you or someone you know. So first, on our website, you'll find online directory of Korean American mental health professionals across the country. You can search by state and find providers who might be a good fit for your needs. We also have reports and bilingual blog posts, whether you're looking for personal stories, tips on finding the right therapist, or insights about navigating this field. There's a lot of great content there for you to explore. And if you enjoy podcasts like myself, we have a great one hosted by Dr. Sam and Sharon Kim. It's for professionals, everyday listeners, and even those who are just curious about mental health research. Definitely worth checking out. Also, we really love your feedback. Please take a minute to fill out our short survey. It helps us to improve and shape future series to better serve you and our community. And lastly, we want to talk briefly about giving. If you found this space meaningful and you'd like to support what MSG is doing, we would be so grateful. Every donation, big or small, helps us keep providing these resources and breaking down mental health barriers in the Korean American community. Truly, it makes a difference. Well, that's it for tonight. And thank you again for spending your evening with us. We hope you leave encouraged and we hope to see you again soon. Take care. Thank you so much.